Queens residents come from nearly 200 countries and speak nearly 200 languages. At the library, we speak diversity. Join us as we honor immigrant heritage this month. For more information, visit queenslib.org/immigrant heritage 22. Looking for things to do at Queens Public Library? We've compiled 125 of them. Pick up a booklet at your nearest library location or view the list online at queenslib.org/things to do. Share your journey with us on social media using the hashtag QPL125, and you will be automatically entered into a drawing for a free Queens Public Library tote bag.
Welcome to Queens Public Library's talk with Heather Clark, author of Red Comet, The Short Life and Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath, a Pulitzer Prize finalist and one of the New York Times best books of 2020. The Boston Globe wrote, as much a critical examination of what it means to be a female artist, to suffer from depression, to be alone, as it is revelatory about this one particular life and the art that came with it. Or from it, excuse me. Entertainment Weekly wrote, a definitive biography. What ultimately bursts off the page is Plath's short, vibrant life, which is too often remembered for the way it ended. That's the irony, isn't it, says Clark? She's so incredibly alive. Hi, I'm Brian Alessandro. For those of you who don't know me, I have written for Interview Magazine, Newsday, Pank, Huffington Post, and have recently adapted Edmund White's A Boy's Own Story into a graphic novel for Top Shelf Productions and Penguin Random House, which will be released this fall. Additionally, I have co-edited an anthology of essays and interviews about William S. Burroughs, which will be published next month. I am also the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the literary journal, The New Engagement. My first novel, The Unmentionable Mon, was published in 2015 by Cairn Press, and my first film, Afghan Hound, was produced by Marriott Media in 2011. Culture Connection, curated by Daniel Zaleski and now in its 9th year at the Queens Public Library, is proud to present international artists from emerging talent to award-winning masters. These disciplines include music, theater, author talks, and film. Now expanding into a virtual format, Culture Connection is currently reaching a global audience. Heather Clark holds a bachelor's degree in English from Harvard University and a doctorate in English from Oxford University. She's the author of The Grief of Influence, Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes in the Ulster Renaissance, Poetry in Belfast from 1962 to 1972. She served as a scholarly consultant for the BBC documentary, Sylvia Plath, Life Inside the Bell Jar. Thank you so much for joining us, Heather, Dr. Clark. I feel like I should be calling you Dr.
Heather's
Clark.
good.
Okay.
Thank you, Brian, for having me.
Of course, it's our pleasure.
I'm a New Yorker. I mean, I'm not a native New Yorker, but I live in New York State now. So
that's great. We're very happy to have you. The title of your biography, Red Comet, is taken from Plath's poem Stings, but it's also a metaphor for Plath's own life and intensity of feeling, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, well, the title is sort of an interesting issue because for almost 7 years, the book had a different title.
Oh,
which was Sylvia Plath, The Light of the Mind, which is a line from her poem, The Moon and the Yew Tree. And I had been kind of attached to that title because I liked that it used the word light and mind. That was sort of the kind of attention I wanted to bring to Plath with this book, was to, I guess, reacquaint readers with her and emphasize how brilliant she was, how cerebral she was, and also to sort of move away from that more pathological treatment that had been done years before. And so, but my editor suggested something bolder needed to take the place of The Light of the Mind. So I have to give credit to my editor who came up with Red Comet from that poem. And it took me a little while to get used to, actually, but now I like it.
Yeah.
Because I do think that, in a succinct way, it gives that sense of intensity,
Yes.
but also brevity, and also leading that way, sort of blazing this trail, I suppose,
Mm.
especially for other women artists. Um,
Absolutely, for sure. I mean, that's what I got from it. I also read, I think it was the Entertainment Weekly interview that you might have done, where you said that you wanted to give Plath considerable space on the shelf with a 3-inch spine. Um,
yes.
is this reading? Can everybody see this? Your biography comes in at a little over, is it 1,100 pages?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
So I do think that you accomplished that, and I thought that that was sort of like a bold aim, really, on your part to give her this weight that she deserves.
Yeah, I mean, well, and sort of literal weight
Yes,
when I
literal
lift
weight.
it up, it's during the pandemic, I was sort of using them for to lift.
Like dumbbells.
Everyone said, "Oh, use soup cans." I thought, "No, I'm gonna use my book."
I have my book.
No,
How
knowing
long
you couldn't get dumbbells.
did
But
considering its incredible length, how long did it take you to write?
yeah, so it took me from the time I, got my proposal into Knopf,
Mhm.
till publication day, about 10 years.
Wow. Wow.
Um,
That's
so
great.
and yeah, I mean, I wanted to give her that serious, critical treatment,
Mhm.
because I didn't think she'd gotten it from
Mhm.
previous biographies, and I think mine is currently the 11th biography of Sylvia Plath.
Wow.
So there were quite a few written before, and partly I was reacting to those, and I felt like, well, this hasn't been done
Mhm.
and she deserves it. And I was really looking to biographers like Hermione Lee,
Mhm.
in England, who had written marvelous biographies of women writers, especially
Sure.
Virginia Woolf
Yeah.
and Lyndall Gordon, and biographers like that. And so I had, I guess, I had the Woolf biography in the back of my mind, and my editor was, I was very lucky in that she supported this vision, to
Mm.
give this woman writer, some serious space. And she actually said at one point, "I want a doorstopper," and I thought,
Well, you
"I
gave
can
it one.
deliver
I
that."
could deliver.
So,
I
yeah.
I'm glad you spoke to that because I was going to ask you, in addition to obviously the biographical research that you had to do into Plath, what your process was like insofar as looking at these other 11 and responding to these other 11 biographies that came before it. And you kind of already spoke to that, but can you say a little bit more about your process?
Yeah, I sometimes, I sometimes envy biographers who are writing the first biography.
Mm,
Um, Maybe 10 years ago, when I had embarked when I embarked upon this project, the thought of writing the first biography of anyone really terrified me.
mm,
And I appreciated the path that a lot of these other biographies had cut. That I was, in a sense, following in their footsteps, and they had done fairly serious and good research before the
sure.
internet. So I have to give them credit.
Sure.
But yeah, I in a way I was reacting, often. I was, reacting to what I thought was, a sensationalistic tone sometimes,
Mhm,
about her suicide, and specious comments about her mental illness. Oh, she was schizophrenic, and
mhm.
with no evidence, right,
Yeah,
of
sure.
things like that. No evidence at all, or neurotic, and that's a word that comes up quite a bit in some previous biographies. And so I guess I wanted to get away from that kind of pathology.
Mhm,
And I don't mean to keep bringing up Hermione Lee, but,
mm,
one of the quotes that kept me writing, through these years, was by Hermione Lee, and she writes in her introduction to, biography. It's a little book published by Oxford University Press. She says that women whose lives have been marked by, self-harm, suicide, mental illness, or abuse are often treated as psychological cases
yeah,
first,
yeah,
and professional
mhm,
writers second.
right.
And I was so inspired by that when I read it, and that really lit the fire. I have to say that I wanted to try as best I could to kind of reverse that for Plath and really treat her as Hermione Lee says, the professional writer first. But I definitely was reacting to previous biographies, and I recently read the Adrienne Rich biography,
Mhm.
which is the
Right,
first.
right.
Wonderful biography by Hilary Holiday. And I envied her because she's not reacting against 10 previous biographies and 40 years worth of
Sure, it's a lot of
biographies. So
freedom there.
she was just like able to kind of say whatever she wanted and not try to correct this or that or so I now think that I would love to write the first biography of
The
Sylvia.
first biography. Wait, would you say that that was really the impetus then, was this fact that so many of the other biographies had been sensationalistic, and also the Hermione, the quote about putting the artist first before the affliction or the challenge. Would you say those were the two things that really drove you to this endeavor?
Yes, I'm an academic, and
Mhm.
so I'm a poetry professor at the University of Huddersfield in England, and I have a transatlantic commute.
I was gonna say, yeah.
Yes, but when I used to teach Plath at a small college in Vermont, where I started my career, it bothered me that there wasn't a biography that I felt like I could assign my students
Mm,
in good conscience that I felt really good about. So that was always something in the back of my mind. But of course, I never dared think about writing a biography of Sylvia Plath. Um, but I ended up writing a book about Plath and Ted Hughes, and it was an academic book, and it wasn't really biographical, but that gave me, I guess, the confidence to think more seriously about it because I had read all of the critical work, and I
sure.
felt like I had a good foundation. And then I just thought, why not? I
Go
was
for
looking
it.
for a
And
third book project, and yeah, it just bothered me that she didn't have, that that big serious biography that so many great male writers have,
sure,
right?
right. Well, now she
And
does. And now
yeah,
she
and so that was part
yeah,
of it. Yeah, that definitely was part of it to like I was saying before, and you were saying, give her that space on the shelf because she was someone who wanted to take up space in her
yes,
life,
yes.
and she wasn't someone that um, tried to, women were encouraged at that time in the 1950s to try to sort of make themselves small and be
Yes.
demure. And she, she lived a bold life, a big, bold life in the time that she had.
That leads me to my next question, actually, which was in your book, you recount the commencement address that the Democratic presidential candidate at the time, Adlai Stevenson, gave to Plath
Yeah.
in her graduating class
Yeah.
at Smith in 1955, in which
Yeah.
he said a woman's place is in the home, tending to her children and husband, but Plath had determined at age 8 to become the poetess of America. Can you discuss the discrimination she faced as a female writer? I mean, it's such a large bear to
Yeah.
tackle, but could you
Yeah. I mean, well, that was something that it shocked me actually doing the research,
yeah,
even though you sort of think about the 1950s and that it wasn't a great time for women especially. It just I couldn't believe the things that I was reading in her journal. I couldn't believe this commencement speech that the liberal darling, this Democrat of his day gave at Smith, telling these women they should all go out and they should aspire to be humble housewives. And that they should what did he say? Once you wrote poetry, now it's the laundry list.
oh my god.
And
It's
he
like
was sort of
cartoonish. It's almost
yeah, he was
cartoonish. Yeah.
trying to console them in a sense that he hoped that they would all be able to adjust to these new, more limited roles as wives and mothers. And he talked about them, holding a baby in one hand and a can opener in the other, and supporting their man. And what's equally shocking to me is that people clapped after
Yeah.
this speech. And I was just actually talking to somebody who's in the Smith class, and she saw this speech and she said, "Oh yeah, we were all madly for Adley,"
Wow.
and it didn't. So just that was accepted, and I put that in my prologue because I felt like that was a very good way to give a sense of the sexism of the time in a short in a short span.
It really illustrates it very, shockingly. You
Yeah,
also
and men controlled the literary world as well. So
oh,
she
sure.
just had to scale these barriers, and she had to work twice as hard, and she did. I mean, she was so incredibly productive and efficient. But yeah, she faced a lot of condescension, let's put it that way, in the late 50s. And she died a week before Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique was published. So, what if she had lived
What
through
if?
the women's movement?
Yeah.
That's a big question.
Yeah.
Who knows?
The aim of your biography was to celebrate Plath's life, as you've said before, not her death. But can you say more about that and also correlate it to Plath's fondness for the Henry James story, The Beast in the Jungle, and her fear of living a passionless life? That really struck me.
Yeah, she had this, she was always worried that she would miss out if she didn't put herself out there, if she didn't take enough risks, and that's part of what I admire about her. I mean, she attempted suicide in 1953, and she spent several months at McLean Hospital. She had shock treatment. I mean, she had a very rough time, but she came out of it. She went back to Smith College, graduated summa cum laude, and went over to England.
Yeah.
I think that was a very brave thing for her to do. She didn't have a support network over there. And she was a second-class citizen at Cambridge University, which then was all male. There were a couple women's colleges, but she did it because, she wanted to live that big life. She wanted to see Europe. She wanted to see Oxford and Cambridge and meet English men. And I mean, she wanted to go to Italy and Rome. And so she was always chasing that. I think that excitement. And she was a very intense person. And the depression, I mean, she suffered from periodic depressions that were extremely severe, but they were episodic. Like they didn't define her entire daily life, right? It wasn't like every single day. I mean, they were episodic.
I know that you wanted to not necessarily focus so intensely on some of the pathological aspects, but they do come up in the book, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are about to what extent did psychiatry as an industry play a role in her illness and ultimately her suicide? This being the 50s and the early 60s, and for all intents and purposes, still the dark ages of mental health care. My master's is in clinical psychology. I took it from Columbia in 2001, and there were things that we were discussing that were going on in the field only 20 years ago that seem so archaic now. So, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about psychiatry itself. And that could be 3 hours itself as a conversation.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And it's a big part of the book. I mean, you know more about psychiatry and psychology than I do. And I came to all of that research I tried to be humble and careful and very much aware that I'm a literary critic and I am not a psychiatrist. I am not a doctor. Having said that, it did seem obvious to me that some of these treatments that were intended to cure her depression might have made her worse. I mean,
sure.
And she even said that the shock therapy she had at one of the particular institutions before McLean, that it was totally traumatic for her. And so they were all, the shock treatment and other treatments she had, insulin coma treatment, things like that. I do suggest that at the end of her life, when she felt the depression descending again, when she writes to her former psychiatrist and says she's terrified of going back into a mental hospital, she's terrified of lobotomies, she's terrified of losing her mind, that the specter of some of those, really awful treatments, it scared her, I think. And who knows? I mean, who knows to what extent that played into, her final decision.
I think, and I told you before the program started, I think that you handle a lot of the clinical stuff with an incredible amount of thoughtfulness and sensitivity and care. And you're never glib about any of it. It seems like you really are working rigorously towards understanding it and the impact it's had on Plath. And I do think that so much of the country, the Western world, is still really mental health illiterate on some level, and that we still don't completely understand that depression isn't a fleeting emotion. It's not this ephemeral thing. It's
Yeah.
it's an actual illness, like cancer is
Yeah.
an illness, you know. Um,
Yeah.
so you mentioned earlier that there have been 11 Plath bios before yours. Many are calling yours the definitive book about her, with multiple revelations. That's got to feel great. And in your prologue, you explain the many ways this biography does things that others have not. Please tell our viewers who haven't yet had a chance to read your excellent book about the access you had to her letters, her diaries, the creative work, the records, and what new information is contained here.
Part of the reason I decided to go through with this, and I knew it would be a massive project, but I was motivated by the fact that there were so many new sources.
Mhm.
All of Plath's surviving letters were published in 2018 in a massive 2 volumes, and so I knew that was coming down the pike, and I had actually photographed all of these letters. You know, I'd spent a long time in the archive photographing them, and then then the books came out, which was it was just easier to use. But I was like, oh god, I didn't need to spend 6 months in the archive. But so that was extremely helpful and revelatory, and I think changed Plath scholarship. There also Ted Hughes's archives at the British Library and Emory University were I felt relatively unmined. I mean, people had been in them, but I just thought there was more there that that would shed light on her time in England and her marriage, and there was. If Ted Hughes's handwriting is incredibly difficult to read, but
Like
and
a
there were,
doctor.
there are all unpublished poems about Plath, and fascinating material in the Ted Hughes archives. And then the in 2019, this cache, it was really a treasure trove, was sold to Emory University by a Plath biographer named Harriet Rosenstein. She had started a Plath biography in the 1970s and never finished it. But she was an incredible researcher. My God. I mean, she interviewed scores of people who had known Sylvia Plath. And remember, it's less than 10 years after Plath's death. Plath died in 1963. So their memories were fresh. And she interviewed Plath's mother and Plath's former doctors. And I mean, it just so much information. So I was able to access that at the last minute. Knopf let me have a couple weeks to go through it. And I'm glad I did, because it did change some of my commentary. I learned more about the drugs that Sylvia was taking towards the end of her life. And when I say drugs, I mean the particular antidepressant that she was on, and other medicine for some of her other ailments, and how these might have not reacted well to each other. And it just seemed like there was another part of the story there with the medical, some of that medical information, just and that's all in the archives. Anyone can go and look. And but so yeah, it was revelatory.
That's great. And you spoke earlier about how, and I agree, and I think everybody would agree, that she was a towering intellectual and a really incisive person. I'm wondering what, she was very self-aware. She understood that she had depression. She understood that a lot of these treatments were really kind of draconian.
Yeah.
She embarked on a kind of intellectual investigation into all of this too. She studied Freud, R.D. Laing, Nietzsche. What other psychologists and philosophers did she look at in order to better understand the complexities of her affliction?
Yeah, I mean, well, you just named some of them, especially Freud. She knew her Freud very, very well, for better or for worse. She wrote her senior thesis on Dostoevsky and the idea of the double in Dostoevsky. And if you read her senior thesis, it's almost like she's sort of trying to understand schizophrenia, the schizoid self. It's a very interesting thesis for this self commentary that is between the lines. And and R.D. Laing, I think, towards the end of her life, I'm pretty sure she read The Divided Self. And I think, the anti-psychiatry movement that started to gain traction in England in the early 60s. I think that she was on board with that because she had really been, she had bad experiences with especially male psychiatrists in America, and she was very suspicious of psychiatrists in general. And when she finally agreed to see a psychiatrist again in 1962-63, she asked for a woman.
Yeah.
And so I just think that she was so scared that she would lose her autonomy and that she would be subjected to more shock therapy. And, one of her friends that I interviewed told me that after Plath's first experience with ECT, that Plath just confided to her and said it was like, the worst thing that she had ever been through. And if she had to go through that again, she would take her own life.
Wow. Yeah.
So that's how traumatic and horrific those early shock treatments were for her. And I think, it left her with a lingering suspicion of psychiatry. And so then she turned to books to try to gain a handle on what was happening to her.
And a lot of that was worked through with the creations of Ariel and the Bell Jar, these two incredible works. What do they accomplish in context of 20th century literature?
Well, I think The Bell Jar is, for me, it's one of the great protest novels of the 20th century. It was sort of marketed as a somewhat lurid story of a college girl breakdown when it came out, and she published it under a pseudonym, Victoria Lucas. But I think it's a very political novel. It's a novel of the Cold War. The first sentence of the novel is about the execution of the Rosenbergs. And from the start, Plath establishes this theme of dissidence and electrocution in Eisenhower's America, and nonconformists being sort of punished. And I mean, there's so many interesting kind of radical themes in that book, and it speaks to the repressions women had to endure during the Eisenhower era. I mean, not for nothing does she set it at a fashion magazine, right? Where women are objectified, and here we have this heroine trying to find her destiny, become a great writer, and she just meets all of these obstacles along the way. And I also think Plath is riffing off of James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. I think The Bell Jar is sort of an ironic retelling of that from a female perspective. And it's much darker. It's much darker than
it's more challenging.
Yeah, part of that book, right? Esther's trying to write a thesis on Joyce when she has a breakdown. So I just think Plath is doing a million things in The Bell Jar. It's so sophisticated. And so I think that's really one of the great novels of the 20th century. Sometimes it's sort of represented as, oh, it's for high schoolers and this kind of thing. But
I think it's a disservice, really, because she was, like you said, she's doing multiple things. She's doing sociological things. She's doing political things. She's doing philosophical things. She's putting the suffering and the struggles of this protagonist in multiple contexts, and she's really dissecting all of them really elegantly and quiet. I think there's like a quiet radicalism to the book.
Yes, and mental illness too.
Mental illness.
In mid-century psychiatry, she talks about the horror. Esther talks about the horror of these shock treatments that she had, and I mean, for all of this to be it was published in 1963, she was so ahead of her time. And then Ariel, I mean, I personally think that there's poetry before Ariel and there's poetry after Ariel. I think it's a watershed in American poetry. It's such a singular, she writes in such a singular, compelling, original voice. There's a rawness and an honesty about those poems that I think still attracts so many readers. And she's still, she speaks truth to power. She's one of the first poets to write from women's experience, women's perspectives, pregnancy, motherhood, abortion, miscarriage, postpartum depression, you name it. And she writes about depression in actually, I think, a very beautiful and lucid way.
I agree, and I think it packs the same wallop that Emily Dickinson's work 100 years earlier had packed. Her husband, the writer Ted Hughes, of course, we can't talk about Sylvia Plath necessarily without at least mentioning him because he played such a vital role in her story.
Yes, yes.
We've seen many films and we've read many books about their Stormy. I think it's fair to characterize the relationship as Stormy.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
what have you uncovered in your book about their marriage that maybe deepens or dispels that narrative, especially where their artistic pursuits were concerned, such as this idea that they wanted to change the language of poetry as like a conscious aim? That was exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I became fascinated by this marriage about, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, because I love Ted Hughes's poetry. I love Sylvia Plath's poetry. And I thought, my God, they were married for 6.5 years. How did they influence each other? So that was all that's really what I'm interested in, I guess, about their marriage. I'm interested in kind of the intellectual foundations of it. It ended terribly.
Yeah.
Absolutely, it was just disastrous for both of them. You know, those last 12 months or so. But the early years, I do think were quite idyllic in some ways and incredibly productive because they were sort of like a team. Plath had broken off informal engagements with a few Yale men and Amherst men, and you know these golden boys, these all American boys that I think her mother wanted her to marry, and I think part of the reason she broke off these relationships was because she felt like they didn't respect her desire to become a great writer. They didn't take her artistic vocation seriously, and she was always looking for a male partner who would take her seriously. And she found that in Ted Hughes. You know, I mean, whatever you want to say about Ted Hughes, he did take her writing seriously, and he called her a genius. He knew she was a genius. And as I say, it all went downhill in a bad way, kind of, you know, after a few years of their marriage. But yeah, those first years, they goaded each other to write in this way that was more bold. They wanted to shock British poetry out of submission. Sometimes I compare them to they were like punk rockers of you know, poetry in England in the 1950s. They just wanted they wanted to kind of reinvoke Yeats and D.H. Lawrence and this visionary intensity and bring that back to American and British poetry. And I should mention, speaking of American poetry, when they lived in Boston, Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath, you know, they were in this mix with Robert Lowell and Anne Sexton, and Hughes was very friendly with Lowell, and Plath took a class with Lowell. And so being married to Hughes, it exposed her to lots of other poets that she might not have met.
What do people get most wrong about Plath? What's the one misnomer you hope to correct, or the one little known fact that you hope to shed light on in the book, other than diverting the attention away from her end and really focusing on her life? Is there one aspect of her character that people keep missing?
I just hear over and over again, like, you know, when I mention Sylvia Plath, I often, it's, you know, please excuse the phrase I'm about to say, but people have literally said to me, "Oh, she's the crazy lady who put her head in the oven."
Yeah.
And that I get that all the time, and that was part of, again, the motivation, and just that she was sort of I think she suffered a bit in her afterlife because of the way she died, and maybe not taken as seriously as she might have been. Now, of course, she's a feminist icon, and I'm not, you know, I'm not talking about feminists in the 60s who embraced Plath, but I think in the popular imagination, she had become something of a cliche, and just this, you know, and other people use words like priestess and and the word cult gets thrown around a lot with Plath, and she's like this
Yeah.
hysterical woman, or the poet of darkness and doom and gloom. And so I wanted to kind of push against all of that mythology and just try to give readers a portrait of the woman who lived her life, as a writer, and who was always, everything that she did was about her writing and trying to become a great writer. I mean, okay, maybe not everything, but but that ambition to become a great writer, I that is sort of the centerpiece of my book, and to just remind people that this is what drove her.
Sure.
This ambition, this drive, this discipline, this will, and she
Sure.
was really very strong person.
There's something in your book that I came across that actually challenged me, and I want to ask you about it. Was Plath a feminist? You write that Hughes maintained she detested career women. Can
Yeah,
you speak more about that? Because
yeah,
it's a
yeah.
little bit incongruent for me on some level.
Yeah, it's such a difficult question, actually.
Yeah,
You think that it wouldn't be, because as I was saying before, I mean, she's absolutely a feminist icon, and
sure.
I'm not trying to take anything away from that. Um, but yeah, Ted Hughes said she was Laurentian, not women's lib. That's his quote. And
Mm.
that she was a disciple of D.H. Lawrence and his
Yep.
philosophy of sexual freedom for both men and women. And so he thought that Plath would not have sort of gotten behind the women's movement, because she did have this sort of conservative streak. She was conservative and conformist on the one hand, but then there was a burning iconoclast within all of that.
Sure. Yeah.
And yeah, she wrote home to her mother about her professors at Oxford who were the grotesque career women, and
Mm.
she could be really nasty about women who didn't have children, women who had abortions. I mean, so all of these, she would say these things that you're like, oh my God, wait, this is not a feminist utterance that I just read.
Right.
But for me, I think she was a feminist or a proto-feminist, because she wanted to have it all at a time when women really did have to choose between a literary career or a family life.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
she just never veered from that determination to write and have her children and be a wife. She thought it was very unfair that so many women felt like they had to choose. Women like Marion Moore or Elizabeth Bishop, who did not have children, and that was her feminism, I think, just saying, no, I'm going to do both, and you can't stop me. And then of course the Ariel poems, there's a lot of feminist themes in those later poems, a lot of rejection of domesticity and female anger and tropes of motherhood. And I mean, there are so many feminist themes in the Ariel poems. But yeah, it's not as kind of simple a question, I think, Plath feminism, as maybe we think.
It's complex and it's really
Yeah.
fascinating, I think. Your publisher sent us a few photos. You have 60 images, we should tell our viewers, in your book. We're not going to look at all of them now. We only have about 8. So Eve, if you could throw those up and maybe we could have Heather narrate, that would be great. Okay, go ahead, Heather.
Okay, so I love this photo. She's in Paris in the spring of 1956. And you can just tell there how happy she looks. She was somebody who loved France. She spoke French very well, deeply immersed in French literature. One of my PhD students is writing about this right now. And so she loved going to Paris. One of her serious boyfriends was part French, and so this is just a moment where I think she's just really enjoying herself.
Really content.
Yeah. Okay, so this is in her Wellesley backyard, probably 1954, 55. This was taken by her boyfriend Gordon Lemire, and she's holding a flower there. I love that. Plath loved to tan. So I wanted to get some of those photos in, because she loved the beach. I mean, I think she was happiest in the sunshine, lying on a beach. This is the Cape. I think this is July 1954. Again, a photo taken by her boyfriend, Gordon Lemire. And yeah, you can see.
Is that Gordon?
Yeah, how happy she looks. That's Gordon. This is Chatham. They were in Chatham. And she always talked about in the winter how pale her skin was and she needed a tan. And as someone who I love the beach as well, and I connected with her about that. This is she's in Yorkshire. This is September 1956, a few months after she had married Ted Hughes. She's actually sitting on a stone wall right next to Hughes's family home in Yorkshire. And as you can see, I hope she brought her typewriter to Yorkshire. She's working on probably a poem, maybe a short story. But that gives you a sense of how
always working. Yeah.
She brings her typewriter to everywhere, right?
I love it. I love it.
And this is again probably September 1956, and this is sort of the iconic photo of Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes right at the beginning of their marriage, when they're wildly in love and they're going to change poetry forever, which actually I think they did.
They did.
They did, and so. Yeah, I mean, that's a poignant photo. This is Plath in Venice, again, her spring break, 1956, from Cambridge, taken by her boyfriend, Gordon Lemire. I shouldn't say boyfriend because they sort of broke up for good on this trip.
Oh boy! Oh my gosh!
So maybe boyfriend isn't the most accurate word, but yeah, she's got her red headband on, which she wore a lot. And again, she's smiling. She's so happy to be in Venice. She loved traveling in Europe. She wanted to live in Europe with Hughes. They were always hatching plans to live in Italy. And then she got pregnant and it became harder. But
Heather, what did Europe, and particularly England, provide Plath that she didn't get, you think, here in the States?
It's so hard to answer that because she went back and forth all the time. When she was in America, she would pine for England, and then in England, she would pine for America, right. And it's just like night and day. Mm-hmm. But I think that a lot. She felt that, well, and Hughes did too. There was a lot of commercialism in America and kind of materialism, and they wanted to get away from that. And she felt like she sort of had more freedom, I think, to be an artist in England. And she didn't have to teach in England. They could work for the BBC. They thought they could write for the BBC, and that's how they would hopefully support themselves, because they didn't want to teach. They just wanted to write. And they just felt like England gave them that opportunity. And of course, Ted Hughes was a very, very famous poet by 1957, 58. So when she moved back to England at the end of 59, he was offered all kinds of BBC commissions, and they had free healthcare.
Oh wow! Well, yeah,
and that was absolutely something she wrote about.
And speaking of Europe, her father was German. He was a German entomologist, Otto. Yes. Her mother, Aurelia, was American, right?
Yeah.
So it's interestingly, because of course, he provided the inspiration for Plath's Daddy, the poem, right? And she was maybe portrayed as the menacing martyr in the Bell Jar.
Oh yeah.
What was her relationship with her parents like then? I have to ask.
Yeah, Aurelia was the daughter of Austrian immigrants, and Plath's father himself was an immigrant. He came to America at age 15 from Prussia. He spoke German and Polish, and just learned English and worked his way up, and eventually got a PhD from Harvard and became a professor. They were both brilliant. Her mother as well. But, she was raised with this Germanic immigrant work ethic. And I think people are sort of so quick to say, oh, she was so neurotic. She had to get A's all the time. She had to publish. She was such a perfectionist. But I think a lot of that is this work ethic that she grew up with in this, family of immigrants trying to prove themselves in America. So yeah, I mean, her parents had very high standards for her, intellectual standards. I think, yeah, if you read The Bell Jar, her mother does not, the woman who is the mother in that novel does not come out well at all.
No.
And Plath and her mother had a really complicated relationship that was probably the most difficult relationship that I had to write about in the book because it was lifelong, right?
Sure.
And she was the person that Plath knew the best, and a lot of love, a lot of hate. It's operatic in a way, their relationship, and tragic ultimately.
Oh, for sure. And I think you've captured a lot of what that was like, especially losing a father at such a young age. How old was she when her dad died?
She was 8.
8?
And so, yeah, he died from complications of diabetes,
Mhm.
and he just hadn't seen it. He was unwilling to see a doctor. He was sort of fatalistic. He thought he had cancer and just thought, I'm not going to bother to see a doctor. And it turns out that he could have been saved if
Yeah,
he had seen a doctor.
sure.
So she had, some resentment about that in her life, and you can kind of see it in Daddy when it comes out.
Oh god, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Who, well, can you tell us a little bit about Platt's time at Smith? What Smith meant to her?
It meant so much to her. She says in her letters, I want to be a Smith girl. She keeps using this phrase, Smith girl,
Mhm.
um, because she didn't want to go to Wellesley because she grew up in Wellesley and she wanted to leave her hometown. She was offered a full scholarship to Wellesley College, but her mother kind of scraped together enough money for her to go to Smith, where she had almost a full scholarship, not quite. But it was at Smith that she met a woman named Olive Prouty, who was quite a well-known writer at the time. And Olive Prouty helped fund her scholarship and became this lifelong mentor and friend and source of financial and moral support. So she met Olive Prouty at Smith, which was really important for her. But she excelled at Smith. I mean, she won every prize there was to win. She
Sure.
was the editor of the Smith Review. She wrote for the newspaper. Oh my God. I mean, just reading her schedule like gives you a panic attack. Just how much this person did every single day. But Smith, she was hungry, I think, for all that Smith had to offer. And she was nurtured by very talented and accomplished women professors.
Yes.
And I think that was very important. And when she got to Cambridge, it was a shock.
Hmm.
He wrote about it, how condescending the Cambridge dons were
Wow.
to women, the male dons. And she just couldn't get over it because she'd had such a wonderful experience in some ways at
Sure.
Smith. Although class was an issue because she was on scholarship, and so there were all kinds of
Sure.
yeah.
Sure. We should mention that Plath had 2 children with Hughes, Nicholas and Frida. Can you
Yes.
talk to us briefly about their trajectories? I know that Nicholas became a fisheries biologist and Frida became a poet and a painter. And tragically, we should also say that Nicholas committed suicide in 2009.
Yes, yeah, and that I, the letter is after Plath's death about the children, and that was sort of the hardest part for me to write about. So, yes, Frida is a poet and painter in Wales,
Mhm.
and as you say, Nicholas tragically died by suicide and suffered from depression, which likely was somehow, genetic. I mean, again, I'm not a doctor, but it's hard not to see a connection there. And also, Plath's maternal grandfather, maternal grandmother suffered from depression and died in an insane asylum.
Mm.
So there seems to be a pretty strong family component here.
Sure.
But yeah, her children were raised by Ted Hughes, and he was a very good father. I mean,
Yeah.
her mother wanted the children to return to America after Plath's death, and thought that she could raise them in Wellesley in Massachusetts. And Ted Hughes thought about it for a little while, and then, I mean, thought about it for 5 minutes, I should say, and then just wait, no,
Yeah.
no, I'm going to raise my own children, and he
Sure.
did. I mean, he did.
And we should also underline the fact that Plath was only 30 when she died. 30. In 1962, I have just a few more questions, and then we'll get to some viewer questions. So if you all would like to start sending in some questions for Heather, please do so. We'll get to them in a few minutes. In 1962, Plath moved into T.S. Eliot's London home in Primrose Hill. Am I getting that right?
Yates.
Yates, I'm
Yes.
sorry. And he was one of her idols, of course. What effect do you think living in his house might have had on her?
She wrote her mother that she thought her work would be blessed by Yates's spirit, and she sort of practiced this thing where she would open a book and see what page the book landed on, and it was a book of Yeats plays, and she landed on, she closed her eyes and put her finger down on the page, and she landed on, prepare the house kind of thing, get the house ready. And so she felt like it was all kind of fated for her. And she was, oh God, she loved Yeats probably more than any other writer. So this was thrilling for her in the winter of 1962 to find that Yeats's house was for rent. And she moved heaven and earth to put down that down payment for a year's rent. And she was just delighted to be living there. And
it was a year later.
Things started. She moved in December 1962, and by February 1963, she was gone. So it was a very short time, but it just shows you how quickly the Depression hit. And I should also mention it was the coldest winter in 100 years in Britain. The heat and electricity was going on and off, so she didn't. So she was very cold. She had 2 young children, an infant and a toddler, and she had not much support. Right, she was pretty much alone. So there were outward circumstances that likely intensified.
Interestingly, to me, her death not a large news item in 1963. Her fame and influence grew over time posthumously, largely due to the writer Al Alvarez and Hughes's efforts to send out her work. Can you talk to us briefly about that?
Yes. Well, Ted Hughes felt extremely guilty in the weeks after Plath's death, and writes these letters to other people, which you can go read them in the archives, about if there is a hell, I am damned in it. I've murdered a genius, things like he's just consumed by guilt, and that he didn't see it coming, and that he didn't work harder to try to stop it or make her feel better. And they had been sort of reconciled. In January of 1963, he went over to her flat and they celebrated the publication of The Bell Jar together. They were drinking sherry, and in her last letter, she says that she doesn't really feel animosity towards Hughes anymore. She's more terrified of going into a mental hospital. So he felt extremely guilty. And I think part of the way that he was trying to kind of make up for this was to promote her work as best he can, and really go around to editors, send her work out, and I think, obviously there were financial motives too, but I genuinely think there was a lot of guilt motivating that. And Al Alvarez, he was the most important poetry critic in England during that time, and he thought Plath was a genius, that she was another kind of Emily Dickinson. So he was another person who was always publishing her poetry and promoting her work after her death. But Ted Hughes obviously ran into a lot of hostility from feminist critics, especially in the 1970s, and he actually stopped going to America because of the protests at his readings.
Wow. We have a question from a viewer. Do you think the movie Sylvia portrayed Plath accurately? And what do you think about the movie The Bell Jar? Did you see either one of the adaptations?
I saw Sylvia a long time ago.
Gwyneth Paltrow portrayed her, right?
I actually haven't watched the Bell Jar movie. Was that the 80s, maybe early 80s. There was a lawsuit about it. I know more about the lawsuit regarding the movie than I do about the movie itself. The movie Sylvia, I mean, I think it was so bizarre for me to watch it because I was immersed in these people's lives, and I just it was too weird. It was too weird for me to watch them sort of come alive on screen when, I'm spending all day reading their letters and this and that. So I had a kind of visceral reaction to it, and which was that I didn't want to keep watching it, I guess. So I probably shouldn't say whether or not I thought the movie was good or not.
What is Plath's legacy? If you had to summarize it, what are we left with? And what will people in 100 years be left with?
I think she helped change American poetry in both style and substance. She was a technical master. I mean, she could write villanelles and sestinas till the cows came home. She understood meter and rhyme. I mean, her early poems were technically perfect. And I think actually when she started to change her style, because she felt almost like the poems were suffocating under the weight of that technical perfection, and they didn't have enough heart in a way. And some of that is Anne Sexton and Robert Lowell's influence. But so she starts to loosen her lines in the late 50s, early 60s, and she starts to write about these taboo, as she called them, subjects like depression and mental illness, things that nice girls didn't talk about in 1959. And as I was saying before, women's issues, and she sort of helped introduce all of these things into poetry. And Anne Stevenson called her one of the first great poets of childbirth in the English language. And so not only did she help introduce all of this new subject matter and sort of introduce female anger into the poetic lexicon, but the way that she writes stylistically, no one had really written like that. I mean, it is sort of Dickensian, Emily Dickinson, these short lines, a lot of enjambment, exclamation points. But, even when it seems like she's writing free verse, she's always using some kind of stanza pattern or rhyme pattern. And I think that her poetry, it seems like it's flying off the page all the time. It has a propulsion to it that few poets, in my opinion, have been able to replicate.
We only have a few minutes, but I'd like to read a paragraph, if you wouldn't mind, from the script of your book. With each passing decade, Sylvia Plath's work seems more astonishing and its achievements harder earned. As Hughes wrote, every word is baraka, the flame and the rose folded together. Poets have often spoken about this ideal possibility, but where else, outside these poems, has it actually occurred? The old comparisons to Medea and Electra no longer hold. If she must be a myth, let her be Ariadne, laying down the threads, leading us out of the center of the labyrinth. Let us not desert her. I thought that was incredibly poignant.
Thank you.
What are you working on now, Heather?
I am currently working on a group biography of Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, Adrienne Rich, and Maxine Kumin, who all knew each other in Boston in 1958 and 59. And for me, this is sort of the year that American poetry changed. Robert Lowell publishes Life Studies that year. Plath meets Sexton. Sexton and Kumin are best friends. Rich meets Plath. And so they're all striking sparks off of each other. And I think it has enormous consequences, not just for American poetry, but for the women's movement and the changes that came after in the 60s and kind of opening up of American culture. So I sort of see it all beginning in Boston in the late 50s and
so you're capturing a moment, really.
Yeah. Sort of a slice of life group biography, and I promise it will be 300.
Is it going to be released by Knopf as well?
Yes, it's under contract with Knopf, and I'm also starting a new biography of Anne Sexton.
All right, exciting.
That will be next.
And do we have any idea of when these books will be released?
Yes. So the Boston book it's due in 2023, so that'll come out in 2024. And the Anne Sexton biography, that'll be a few years.
We have time for one
But also
final
will not be 1,000 pages.
I want to end with this really great question we just got from one of our viewers. Do you have any sense where Plath might have been going artistically had she not taken her life?
I think that she had hit her stride with those aerial poems. They were so different from the poems she had written, I would say pre-1959, which were, like I was saying before, technically perfect, but sometimes quite brittle. Not all of them, but the poems that she wrote sort of after she takes Lowell's class, after she meets Sexton, Hughes is kind of prodding her to open up her verse more. She says in I think it was early 1963 or late 1962, I can't remember. She writes to her mother and she says, "I'm writing the poems that will make my name. I am a genius of a writer." She says that, and she knows it.
She was self-aware.
Yeah, she knows it.
True, yeah.
So I feel like she would have continued writing in that same style, and maybe it would have evolved. How long can you sustain that? That's another question.
True.
Very few poets are able to be like Yeats and sort of write these incredible poems until they're in their old age. We don't know. I mean, we just don't know, but thank God we have the poems we do.
Yes, we're all very grateful for her, and we're grateful for your book. It's really magnificent. And Eve, if you could put Heather's website for our viewers, if they want to learn more about her and her work, it'll be put into the private chat, I believe, so you'll be able to access it, and it'll be archived, of course, in there once the program ends. There it is. It's just heatherclarkauthor.com. Heather,
there are a lot of Heather Clarks out there.
Yes, Heather Clark author. Thank you so much for this. We really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and have a great, safe weekend.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.